In August 1997, Apple had lost nearly $2 billion over the previous 2 years. Its stock had fallen to near its lowest level in a decade. Internally, the burn rate was severe enough that analysts were describing the company as having less than 6 months of viable operating runway left. What happened next is one of the most counterintuitive transactions in the history of computing. Bill Gates, the man who had watched Apple sue Microsoft for 9 years over a stolen graphical interface, called Steve Jobs and offered him a check, $150 million, non-voting, no board seats, no strings that showed. It was announced as a rescue. It was framed as a partnership. But in the 5 clauses of that deal, in the fine print signed between the 2 most famous rivals in the history of technology, was something far more calculated. Gates didn't save Apple because it was the right thing to do. He saved it because he needed it alive. The story starts with a better metaphor than most corporations get. 1976. A garage in Los Altos, California. Steve Jobs is 21 years old. Steve Wozniak is 25. They name their company after a piece of fruit and price their first product at $666.66. Most people think it's a joke. The idea isn't just a computer. It's a claim about who computing belongs to. By January 1984, Apple has grown to nearly 2,000 employees and is worth close to $2 billion. The company spends close to $1 million on a single 30-second Super Bowl advertisement that airs exactly once. A woman throws a hammer at a giant screen, broadcasting a totalitarian figure, unmistakably IBM. The final frame reads, "You'll see why 1984 won't be like 1984. The Macintosh unveiled at that. Macworld gets a 2-minute standing ovation from its own developers. Apple is the rebel. Apple is the revolution." And this mythology runs so deep that for the next decade it will allow the company to charge premium prices, retain fanatical users, and mistake passion for a business model. In 1985, a year after the hammer ad, the Apple board decides that Jobs is the problem. He is stripped of his division and eventually forced out entirely. The founder, removed by the company he invented. He will not return for 11 years. He leaves with a small founding team to build a computer company called Next. Next will produce beautiful, revolutionary, unmarketable hardware. Apple, now led by a succession of professional managers, will produce something even more damaging, a perfect case study in what happens when a cult brand loses its high priest. After Jobs left, Apple cycled through 4 CEOs in 11 years. John Sculley came from Pepsi. He understood marketing, but not engineering. Michael Spindler came from the European technology industry. He understood manufacturing, but not brand. Gil Amelio came from National Semiconductor. He understood neither. Under Sculley, Apple launched the Newton, a handheld personal digital assistant that arrived a decade too early and famously misread the user's handwriting so badly it became a national punchline. Under Spindler, Apple licensed the Mac OS to third-party manufacturers. The clone program was designed to grow the Mac ecosystem. Instead, it cannibalized Apple's own hardware sales without expanding the market. The plan had no exit. Under Amelio, by fiscal 1996, Apple posted a loss of $816 million in a single year. The product lineup had bloated to 350 separate models and configurations, most of them indistinguishable from each other. Market share had fallen from 9% at its peak to less than 3%. In December 1996, the board authorized the acquisition of Next for $430 million, bringing Jobs back as an informal advisor. It was described as a technology acquisition. It was a rescue mission for an idea. Jobs arrived to find a company so entangled in its own product roadmap that he reportedly walked into one planning meeting, drew a simple 2x2 grid on a whiteboard, and said, "We need 4 products, nothing else. Portable or desktop, consumer or professional, 4 boxes. Everything that didn't fit was cut." By early 1997, Bill Gates had a problem that had nothing to do with Apple. The Department of Justice had been scrutinizing Microsoft for competition violations since 1993. The question the government was circling was blunt. If Windows ran on more than 90% of the world's personal computers, And if the Windows ecosystem made it commercially impractical to build competing software, was that a market? Or was it a monopoly? The prosecution's case was simple. What would make it weakest was a credible competitor. What would make it unanswerable was Apple dying. In early 1997, Gates reached out directly to Jobs. The deal they negotiated had 5 provisions. First, Microsoft would invest $150 million in Apple as non-voting convertible preferred stock, to be held for a minimum of 3 years. Second, Microsoft would commit to a 5-year continuation of Microsoft Office for the Mac platform, the software that tens of millions of Apple users relied on to stay compatible with the business world. Third, Apple would make Internet Explorer the default browser shipped with every copy of Mac OS, giving Microsoft a critical weapon in its war against Netscape. Fourth, the two companies would enter a broad cross-licensing agreement covering their existing and future patent portfolios for 5 years. Fifth, Apple would drop all remaining legal claims against Microsoft, including the residual claims from a copyright dispute that had been in and out of courts since 1988. Gates got a living competitor to point to, a guaranteed browser win, and a legal ceasefire. Jobs got $150 million, a guaranteed Office ecosystem, and a psychological signal to the market that the largest software company in the world believed Apple was going to survive. Both parties described it as a partnership. It was something more efficient than that. On August 6, 1997, Apple's stock closed sharply higher, one of the largest single-day moves in the company's history. In the weeks and months that followed, Jobs moved with a speed that suggested he had known for a long time exactly what needed to happen. He killed the Newton. He ended the Mac clone program, overnight removing the drain on Apple's hardware margins. He canceled 250 of the 350 products in Apple's lineup, reducing the company from a catalog to a concept. By August 1998, 1 year after the deal, Apple shipped the iMac. It came in 5 translucent colors. It looked like nothing else on a store shelf. And it cost $1,299 at a moment when the conventional wisdom insisted consumers only wanted cheap beige boxes running Windows. Apple sold 800,000 iMacs in the first year of production. In fiscal 1998, Apple posted a net income of $309 million. The company had moved from an $816 million annual loss to a $300 million annual gain in less than 2 years. It is tempting to credit Bill Gates for this. The more honest calculation is this. The $150 million investment represented less than 12% of the cash Apple already had on its balance sheet the day the deal was announced. What Gates provided was not a financial rescue. It was a credibility signal, a message to the market, to developers, to enterprise buyers, that the dominant company in computing believed Apple was going to survive. The signal was worth more than the investment. On August 6, 1997, Steve Jobs walked onto the stage at Macworld Boston. He had no official title at Apple. He introduced himself as the chairman and chief executive of Pixar. He wore jeans and a black turtleneck in a room that wasn't sure whether he was the company's future or one of its larger shareholders. He spent the first part of the keynote talking about what Apple was going to do differently: product focus, brand, a new advertising campaign called Think Different. The crowd was cautiously hopeful. Then he said, "We also need to let go of some old relationships, some old litigation, and to replace those with partnerships." He told the audience he had a special guest, joining via satellite downlink. The screen behind him lit up. Bill Gates was 20 feet tall. The crowd booed. There were gasps. Some people laughed, the kind of laugh that happens when something is both absurd and unbearable at the same time. The man whose company had spent 9 years being accused of stealing Apple's interface was now looking down at every developer, every loyalist, every true believer in that building, from a screen the size of a building. Gates said he was excited about the partnership. He praised the Mac platform. He mentioned that Microsoft served 8 million Macintosh customers. He called the renewed commitment very exciting. Jobs let him finish. Then he turned to face the audience and said the line that people would still be quoting 30 years later. "We have to let go of this notion that for Apple to win, Microsoft has to lose." The room went quiet in the way rooms go quiet when someone says something true that you didn't want to hear. After the press left, after the television crews and the photographers and the live blogs, Jobs was spotted in the Apple cafeteria eating alone. Not a founder's dinner, not a victory celebration. Just a man with a lunch tray and a clean table, in a company that had just told the world it needed its enemy to survive. Years later, Jobs would tell his biographer Walter Isaacson that he deeply regretted the staging decision, that having Gates appear looming on a giant screen had sent the exact wrong message, that it made him look small and Apple look small, as if everything was in Gates' hands. He was not wrong. The visual has outlasted both of them. Gates, enormous, looking down. Jobs, small, looking up. The most honest image of where Apple stood in the summer of 1997. 9 months after the deal was announced, on May 18, 1998, the Department of Justice filed its antitrust complaint against Microsoft. The case that followed was the most significant corporate antitrust proceeding in the United States since the Standard Oil breakup at the turn of the century. For 2 years, the DOJ argued that Windows' market dominance, running on more than 95% of personal computers, constituted an illegal monopoly. And here is the part that is rarely told. During the trial, Microsoft's lawyers attempted to argue that Apple was proof of competition, that the Mac existed, that consumers had a real choice. Judge Thomas Penfield Jackson did not accept the argument. The court defined the relevant market as Intel-compatible personal computer operating systems. Apple ran on different hardware. Mac OS was outside that market definition entirely, and even in the hypothetical, even if you added Mac OS into the calculation, Microsoft's share of the combined market would still have stood at more than 80%. Bill Gates had paid $150 million for an antitrust defense. The judge ruled it didn't count. Microsoft was found to have monopoly power. The initial remedy called for the company to be broken into 2 separate entities, one for operating systems, one for everything else. That order was later reversed on appeal, and the case was ultimately settled in 2001. But the finding of monopoly power was never overturned. By 2003, Microsoft quietly sold its remaining Apple stake, the converted common shares it had held since the original preferred stock agreement, a tidy exit for a position that had outlived its strategic usefulness. And then the decade began that made the whole story look completely different. In 2001, Apple launched the iPod. In 2007, the iPhone. In 2011, for the first time in the company's history, Apple briefly became the most valuable company in the world. In 2018, it became the first company in history to reach a market capitalization of $1 trillion. By 2026, Apple would trade at approximately $3 trillion. The company that needed a check to survive became worth 20,000 times that check. Gates had created, at $150 million, the most dangerous long-term competitor in the history of computing. There is a version of this story that is clean. Microsoft saved Apple. Apple thanked Microsoft by surviving. Computing became richer for the competition. 2 companies, 2 visions, 2 ways of thinking about what a machine could mean. The market worked. That version is not wrong. It is just not the whole story. The Department of Justice that spent years trying to break Microsoft apart for monopoly power now has an active antitrust case against Apple, alleging that the iPhone ecosystem, with its dominant share of the United States smartphone market, operates as an illegal monopoly by the same logic that was used against Microsoft in 1998. The players rotate. The pattern doesn't. Both companies now trade at approximately $3 trillion. They sit at the center of the global digital economy, they control the platforms that billions of people depend on, and they are both, at this exact moment, under investigation for the conduct that made them what they are. In August 1997, Bill Gates wrote a check to keep his biggest rival alive. He called it a partnership. His rival used that check to become something he could not have imagined. The final question is simple, and it has no clean answer. If you were in his position, and you knew what he did not know, would you have written the check?